And I will start by my question. When I invited you for this series, Ed, and I said it's about human rights, you said, I don't do human rights. And I said, well, it's all about human rights, what you're doing. And I was thinking about human rights in the making, or the people who don't have rights at the really center of the history of human rights. So since I told you that, maybe you could tell me what you've been thinking.
Sure. Yeah. Um, yeah, I definitely don't approach this topic from a human rights perspective, and I really don't implement a large human rights perspective in my research at all. But that's made it really interesting to prepare for this talk and think about things a little more through that framework. Of course, human rights and the rights of workers come up all the time in my research, but it's just not usually the lens I use. I really come from primarily a social history background. So really interested in looking at how these changing factors of tobacco farming economics and politics and diplomacy, how all these factors changed what the workforce looked like and what the experiences of workers were like. Um, so the really big thought I had kind of rethinking my project through this frame of human rights um, was just really to have the realization of how exceptional conditions on the ground for migrant farm workers have been, how different they've been um, from the vision put forward by human rights discourses, like the UN Declaration on Human Rights and so on. Those types of ideas contrast so sharply with what the conditions have been for migrant farm workers. So it's been really interesting to me to think through that kind of Hannah Arendt inspired lens that I mentioned of migrant farm workers as not even having the right to have rights in a sense. And thinking about that contrast between the rise of human rights discourse and yet the persistence of these groups of people, including migrant farm workers, who are kind of outside of these frameworks. And the last thing I'll kind of say about that is human rights, claims to human rights are definitely an important part of the politics of advocating for better conditions for migrant farm workers. And I think that makes a lot of sense as a way to advocate. Um, I don't personally think that the improvement in migrant workers' conditions is necessarily going to come from a triumph of rights discourses, even though that's used as part of the strategy. I think it's basically going to come from politics. So from movements and from farm workers being successful in holding politicians' feet close enough to the fire that they're forced to make some sort of change. So I don't hold a lot of hope in the frameworks of human rights alone producing change here.
Okay, thank you. That fits a question that Matthew Sif wrote in the chat box. Maybe, Ed, you can stop sharing your screen so we don't, yeah. So he says that he's asking you, and I think you've partly answered, to what extent charter challenges might have helped change the situation. And he was remembering um, that a few years ago, tomato farm owners were called into question on both the treatment of migrant farmers and limiting their access to healthcare. So has that led to any progress?
Yeah, there are definitely people who can speak to this better than me. But the big thing to say about charter challenges, there was a big case brought by the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, a few years ago, challenging the fact that farm workers in Ontario are not able to unionize. Um, and they challenged that under the charter, the freedom of association. And that case, the UFCW ended up losing that case with the court reasoning that freedom of association does not equal freedom to unionize. So that would be the major charter challenge, and it was a total failure, as incongruous as that decision would seem to a reasonable person, in my opinion. But I see Eugenie is on the call, and
There you go. She's telling you that she's doing exactly what you say is not possible there, or is not. So very good. She's saying we, Virginie, at the Association of the Rights of Household and Farm Workers are currently preparing a charter challenge of the employer's condition of the SAWP. So, okay, the question from Laura, which started in the chat, she's thanking you very much for a fabulous talk and is saying that she has a question about the quote from Anna Arendt on the rights to have rights, because she was inspired by her observation of the refugee experience as a result of fascist and totalitarian oppression, which is political. But the case studies you have provided here are very powerful and they speak to economic oppression. So she wanted you to talk about human rights and economic regimes, especially because you're talking about race and exclusion.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I guess what I'd say to that is basically in the cases I presented, so the exclusion of workers from the US South and from the Caribbean, what I'm really interested in, or was really interested in this talk, was kind of the economic consequences of exclusion. So kind of violations of people's human rights, not just leading to an immediate impact, but having these long-term consequences with economic marginalization and lack of opportunity. And the idea of this right to have rights really helped me to think through this. Because whereas immigrants from Europe and white immigrants from the US did have the right to have rights in Canada and therefore could profit from tobacco farming, these two groups of Black workers, one of whom would later become a very prominent part of the workforce, did not even have the right to take a stab at it. So I've definitely been very interested in thinking through the economic contexts of such forms of exclusion.
There is another economic question here, the last one to be written in the chat box. If there were a decrease in participants in that program, would, and the use of vulnerable migrant workers, and that would stop cutting costs, would the cost of what we eat be higher?
Probably. One interesting anecdote on this line of thinking happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the farm that was hit the hardest by the pandemic and had a bunch of workers, almost all their Mexican migrant workforce, taken ill with COVID. That farm turned to offering Canadians $25 an hour to harvest asparagus in this case. So in contrast to the frequent narratives among farmers that Canadians simply won't do this work and that they couldn't afford to pay the wages that would be required. We really see in that case that when push comes to shove, that's actually not true. And farmers can find ways to pay Canadians to do this work.
Yeah.
If wages were raised and conditions were improved, of course that costs farmers more money, and of course that adds to their bottom line. So probably the cost of food would go up, but probably not very substantially. And the one example I'll bring in there is an organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in the US, in Florida. And they've had a very successful, essentially a boycott pressure campaign where through essentially public shaming and public protest tactics have shamed huge buyers of tomatoes, like major grocery store chains, major restaurant chains, like McDonald's and so on. They've pressured all these buyers of tomatoes to pay 1 penny more per pound to farmers for those tomatoes. And with that 1 penny more per pound, they've been able to implement this whole system of support centers for workers, legal clinics, improving housing conditions. And that's 1 penny per pound. The way that would come down to the consumer to buy a single tomato at the grocery store would be obviously a fraction of a cent. So it would raise prices, but I don't actually think all that much.
Laura McDonald said she enjoyed your talk and says that she'd like you to talk about women workers, part or if they were or not part of the flows of migrants from the southern U.S. because she's been working with Christina Gabriel on the exclusion of women from the SAWP program, but she'd like to know in the precedent that you mentioned if this was the case as well.
Yes, good question. Yes, there were women who came in that movement, and the story there sort of changes over time. So in the early decades, when a number of people in that movement ended up staying on in Canada and becoming tobacco farmers, in that case, a common pattern would be for men to come first as wage laborers, and then if they decided to stay, they'd come back up with their families and stay as a family. Tobacco farming, like most farming, was very much a family affair, usually with significant supplementary wage labor. Um, but there are, even as the program becomes more of an actual program, there are women who still participate as wage laborers, particularly in one job in tobacco farming that was very gendered female. And there's a picture of it in one of my earlier slides. But it's basically the job of tying tobacco leaves to sticks, and then the sticks get hung in the kiln for curing. And that job of tying was gendered as female. And so some women workers did come up to work those jobs, more in some years than in others. But in some years, it would have been as much as a few hundred coming up to do those jobs.
Karen Cook is asking a global question. Canada is not the only country struggling in managing its migrant workers, as it can be seen in the UK, Poland, and Ukraine. And she's asking if you think that the rise of nationalism and populism recently has caused further prevention of the advancement of migrant workers around the world.
It's interesting. It certainly doesn't help in terms of society valuing migrant farm workers. But what I talked about earlier as guest worker programs as sort of this compromise between employers and people who are in favor of immigration restriction, we still see that kind of rearing its head today too. Um, I, from my understanding, for example, Donald Trump is okay with temporary foreign worker programs in the US because it's such an alternative to undocumented migration that he's represented as such a threat to the nation and so on. So there's kind of this duality happening here, where in the complete rejection and racism against undocumented migrants, these kinds of more orderly migrations might seem more palatable because you can ensure that workers leave afterwards and don't become permanent citizens.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Stephen is asking, was there any point in time when colored migrant workers, especially Blacks formally or informally, protested what was obviously calculated official policy to exclude them?
I haven't found, well, particularly in the example of the US workers, I haven't found any examples of protest. Um, it's really hard to even see any of the Black workers from the US who did come in 1966 and a little bit in the subsequent years before the movement petered out. In my research for that article, I, for example, could not find the name of a single African American worker. Even when the 26 Black workers were turned away by farmers who didn't want to employ them, the way their story made it into the newspapers was through a woman who worked for the Travelers Aid Society in Buffalo.
Mm.
They went to that Travelers Aid Society to seek assistance after being sent back across the border. And she sort of alerted the press and was helping them out. And so that would be kind of as close as it would get to a protest. Possibly those workers encouraged her to go to the press to shed light on the situation. Possibly she did it on her own. These are the types of things I can't know. So I'm dealing with a lot of archival silences in that story, which is why it's in the article's title.
Megan Carrier here asking if you know if there has been pushes to lower the number of migrant workers by getting students and Canadians to do this work instead, as was initially apparently the plan when COVID started, or
Yeah,
has it been abandoned altogether?
it's basically been abandoned. It was sort of floated as an idea, but it was an idea that didn't make a whole lot of sense because farmers have become totally dependent on these programs, and it's central to their whole way of operating, their whole business model. Um, so this idea of it being somehow easier to have uh, Canadian students mobilized and sent off to farms around the country and trained and do this work, the idea that that would be easier than simply implementing some COVID safety protocols and continuing to bring in migrant workers, that was sort of preposterous. Um, People think that farm work is kind of very easy and low skilled and so on, and things are a bit more complicated than that. But so that really shows like the utter dependence of Canada's food system on these workers, that it's way easier to find ways to continue these programs than to very quickly find ways to mobilize young Canadians or anyone else.
Good. Louis is asking if the arrival of the point system, which is a more general question, led to less racial exclusion in Canadian migration policies.
Um, it definitely led to less racism in Canada's permanent immigration policy. It's sort of curious because the SOP, the Farm Workers Program, is sort of this weird exception amidst this trend of deracialization in Canadian immigration. So the change in those policies through orders in council in 1962 and 1967, they implement the point system. They also prohibit discrimination, not just by race, but also by national origin. And yet, at the exact same time and down to the present, we have this program where employers can select workers based on their country of origin. So when employers sign up to request farm workers in the SOP, they check off whether they want Jamaicans, Mexicans, Barbadians, Trinidadians. So it's this very curious exception. And so is the program explicitly racist in its structure? No, I'd have to say not, but it certainly is explicitly enabling discrimination based on national origin in its structure, which then leads to all sorts of manifestations of racism, of course.
So we have 7 minutes and 7 questions. So I apologize to those whose questions I won't ask, but we can save this chat and we'll think about what you're saying. But one simple one is, what's the proportion of small scale farmers, or do you have any idea of that, and big agribusiness in the hiring of migrant farmers in Ontario?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, the program is overwhelmingly used by large farmers. And this I am increasingly finding a fascinating wrinkle, because farmers who employ workers in the SOP use this narrative of struggling family farmers very much to their advantage. They say it's impossible to make money in agriculture. This program is the only thing we have going for us. We need these workers. And not only that, but we need these workers with minimum restrictions and minimum protections, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, if you look at it, the vast majority of employers who hire SOP workers are in the very upper echelons of Canadian agriculture in terms of revenues. I actually have a stat I found. I'm going to pull it out here. So 88% of employers in the SOP gross over $250,000 a year. So that puts them in the top 22% of all farmers. And then 50% of employers in the SOP gross over $1 million a year, which puts them in the top 4% of farmers. So the vast majority of employers here are the big guys of the big guys.
Yeah.
But they've been very effective at using the narrative that they are the small guys to get things to their advantage.
A question from Tom Fraser, thinking about labor organizing, were there moves towards the organization of migrants' labor in the 60s and 70s? Were these moves corresponding and perhaps tied with the rise of the farm workers movement in the US?
So labor organizing in the 60s and 70s. Essentially what I've found in terms of labor organizing in that period is a lot of essentially spontaneous workplace organization, not really much in terms of actual unionization in Canada, but there's no shortage of worker resistance in tobacco, and I'm sure in other crops too, if you looked into it. And even actually among migrant farm workers from the Caribbean in the early years of the program. So the first year those workers actually worked in tobacco specifically was 1967. And in that very year, there were wildcat strikes by Trinidadian workers who discovered that they were being paid less than their Canadian counterparts for the same work. And they said, to hell with it, and stopped working. This caused a huge diplomatic kerfuffle. The deputy minister of labor flew up from Trinidad. They ended up repatriating 6 workers. That was in the very first year that there were SOP workers in tobacco. And there are certainly examples of Canadian workers protesting as well. But it remained at the level of kind of worker self-organization. It never coalesced into unionization, certainly not in that period.
Thank you very much. So I've got one comment from Vince Pietropaulo, whose photos feature in your presentation, and then one philosophical question by Megan. So there you go. Vince says, if these migrant workers were actually becoming citizens, then there would be no need for migrant workers because they would be here already. And Megan is asking this question, is there any way that a migrant worker program could ever be ethical? So I'll let you comment on that for 3 minutes and then I'll close.
Yeah, I guess, okay, I'll answer the second question first, which I would say yes. I don't see any reason why it couldn't be ethical. Despite the very poor conditions, my computer's making noise, sorry about that. Despite the very poor conditions for migrant farm workers, a lot of workers depend on this income to support family businesses back home, support their children going through education, and a lot of them actually enjoy the work. They don't enjoy being mistreated and housed in terrible conditions and being forced to do dangerous tasks and so on. But a lot of them are farmers, they're agriculturalists, and they take pride in this work and they're interested in agriculture. And if they had the opportunity, many of them would like to make a living on the land in Canada, like their predecessors who I talked about. Others would prefer to have to keep engaging in migrant work, in migrant labor, and not settle in Canada. So I don't see any reason why, if conditions weren't improved, that there could not be an ethical program where people could choose whether or not they wish to stay here or keep cycling back and forth. And Vince's question was, yeah, so if there was access to permanent residency, would the migrant labor cease to exist? I don't know, but my guess is actually no, sort of connected to what I was just saying, which is that certainly not every worker in this program wants to live in Canada permanently. They should absolutely have the option, but not everyone does, and I have no idea what the breakdown would be. But some people are perfectly happy to keep going back and forth. But of course, they appreciate better conditions in doing so. So of course, there would be changes in how things work if there was a pathway to permanence. And so I like to think about this kind of political project, not just as one of reforming migrant farm labor, but rethinking how agriculture works in general and how capitalist agriculture works. Because overwhelmingly, it's always been set up in a way that's been exploitative to workers. And there's been some exceptions here and there. So I think it's important to think about those exceptions. But I like to think not just about how we can improve this migrant labor system, but how we can make agriculture a better place to work.
Okay, before I thank Ed, I would like to say 3 things. First of all, thank you very much for the audience, your questions and your comments. I would like to invite you all to the next talk, which is in 2 weeks from now, and will be about the rights of minorities in Canada, especially around the case of Catholic and Francophone workers in Quebec around World War II. And then I would like to say that we use the privacy of the chat box to learn that it's your birthday today, Ed. So happy birthday from all of us. And finally, I would like to thank you so very much for a very good and engaging talk on a very important topic. So thank you very much and good luck for the book. And we're all looking forward to reading you further.
All right. Thanks so much, Dominique. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.